This is Creepy, a podcast dedicated to sharing the most famous, chilling, and disturbing creepypastas and urban legends in the world. Whether these stories truly happened or are simply fabrications is for you to decide. These stories may contain graphic depictions of violence and explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
Creepy presents When Using a Public Cabin in Rural Alaska, Make Sure You're Alone. Written by Kyle Harrison and narrated by Nate Dufort.
Living below zero is not meant to be fun. It's definitely not for everyone. And I certainly wouldn't be here if it wasn't for a rather nasty divorce a couple years back. The average temperature here is -20 Fahrenheit, with an added 10 degrees and wind chill or more if Mother Nature's feeling especially feisty. And that's on a good day. Thankfully, I had the skills to get a fairly decent job for this area, that of a forest ranger. The position's a bit different from the usual kind in other places since we're so remote. Most of the time, I'm traveling across the snowy wilderness, stocking up public cabins with supplies. These cabins usually have what some call backcountry accommodations, and by that I mean we supply the bare minimum, and the rest is up to you. This includes food, water, and bedding, so don't expect getting a 5-star Hilton unless the last camper that stopped by was kind enough to leave you something. Accessing them isn't easy, and that's because these aren't really meant for your ordinary traveler. To even make it up here, you need to be prepared. I can't even tell you how often I find frozen corpses of hunters just a few miles from these cabins, killed over simply because they didn't plan ahead. One of the biggest things that I have to contend with besides weather are wild animals. These creatures are smart and like to break into the places to steal anything they can get their grubby little paws on, which is why we stress that campers and such shouldn't leave anything behind. It isn't simply to make this whole enterprise unpleasant for you, it's to keep the site safe. I'd gotten a call from my operations manager about just such a situation, where a report came in from one of our troopers about a cabin that looked broken into by a bear or something. The officer was already on the trail of the offender when I was tasked with heading out to make sure the cabin itself was still up to snuff. Travel, ordinarily, is a 3-part process. First, I had to wait for one of the bush pilots to take me to the closest drop point, just to avoid an extra 30-mile trek through rugged terrain. The flight is crazy with fog and winds and takes about an hour to reach the nearest fuel site that is still another 15 miles from the cabin that was reported. From there, I wait for a sledder, trying to stay warm by standing as close to the pumps as possible while the plane fills their tank. I know that their job is likely 10 times harder than mine, having to go deliver goods to people that live in even further remote areas. For some, this place is a paradise, and others, it's hell. I'm sure you can guess where my opinions lie. When the sledder arrives, he tells me that he can take me to a 2-mile marker that is meant to be a game trail for the cabin. It doesn't look like it's been used in a while, but I thank him and pay him for his services. I know that because of the way this business works, I'll have to wait until tomorrow before seeing another sledder to head back. At this point, as I move forward, I am completely alone. Or so I think. There's some comfort with loneliness, I will admit. The wind is all you hear as you trek across the wide-open Alaskan wilderness, and there isn't a soul in sight. It's soothing to realize that nothing can hurt you. But I have to be on guard constantly, aware of my surroundings at all time. Every branch that is broken or a scratch against the trunk of a tree is telling me a story about what happened here. Something that could change the scenic landscape into a hellscape. But there aren't any telltale signs to make out as I approach the cabin, In fact, it would seem that this one is completely abandoned. Not even the hint of the break-in like the report claimed. It didn't make sense. I can't be sure until I get inside, though. So I head toward the main entrance and wiggle the door handle. It opens with ease, revealing a very simple, rustic interior. There isn't so much as a footprint on the ground or even a tuft of hair to show that an animal's been through here. The cabin appears untouched. But I know that can't be right because I notice a hunting rifle wedged behind the door and a canteen of drinking water. So someone has definitely been here, I realized, as I put my own gear down and decided to take a look around. The first thing to do for any cabin is make sure you have plenty of firewood, so I made my way toward the tool shed, a few meters from the main property, and along the way, I did my best to search for any sign that there was another person nearby. The wind was much quieter now, giving me a chance to listen and meditate on what to do next. I hated the fact that I might have come here for nothing. But maybe whoever had supposedly broken in was long gone. It just didn't seem like there'd be much for me to do except sleep and head home, I realized. Not necessarily a bad ending for the trip, I told myself. I opened the shed and found the axe was missing. My guess about another person being here once again, raising red flags. And I immediately felt the need to watch the landscape. It was so silent, you could only hear my own tromping through the snow as I returned to the main cabin. I told myself to be calm and to think. Was someone in the tree lines? Watching and waiting, I wondered as I stepped back to the cabin. It was a bit more hurried this time, feeling as though my mind was playing tricks on me as I returned. To my utter disbelief, there were more furnishings now. A rug, some coolers, and a mattress. I'd only been outside for less than 10 minutes, and I hadn't seen anyone approach the cabin, I thought as I got my own pistol off my hip and checked the rest of the tiny property. There wasn't another entrance into this place, so how would they manage to sneak past me when I went to the tool shed? I peered toward the tree lines. The whole area looked deserted. But these new items in the cabin did not make me feel at ease any longer. I was being watched. I was sure of it. And I knew I would need to keep vigilant the rest of the evening. No sleep for me. That wasn't going to be easy, though, as I knew I would need to journey out again for fresh food and water, or else I wouldn't be able to make it through the night. I could potentially starve myself, but I knew that would make me more vulnerable to whatever was out there, roaming in the wilderness. I decided as I left out the front door to prop up a trap of sorts to see if I might be able to catch the perpetrator in the act of entering and leaving. A simple tripwire with a bell attached would do the trick for any animal. But I knew this was likely a skilled hunter, so I had to think outside the box and have the wiring set up inside where it'd be difficult to see. It would probably only work once, but it'd get the job done, I thought. I looked toward the snowy fields that surrounded me and felt uneasy. The entire territory was deathly still now. Not even the sign of a deer on the trail or birds in the sky. Like everything had come to a stop. Grabbing the hunting rifle, I decided to make a quick run to the nearest forest for dinner, and then get back as fast as I could. The longer I stay out, the more exposed I am. I only went maybe a mile from the cabin, using the deep woods to the east as cover to watch a grove of trees and pick off a few squirrels. It wasn't much, but in this wasteland, I knew not to be picky. As I shot my third, I heard the bell ring from the cabin and didn't even get a chance to grab the kill. Instead, I was running, leaping through the snow to find out who or what was there waiting. The door was wide open and I saw boots to the side of the bed. Immediately feeling on edge as I shouted to the door, "This is Ranger Tom Freyer. Come out of there peacefully, and there won't be a problem," I urged. I could even see wet footprints of someone that had entered. There was no response, and I cautiously peered through the empty entry. I ventured inside, shocked and confused, to see the cabin mysteriously empty, except it now had even more furnishings. Canned food, flowered plants, and hunting trophies on the wall. It felt like this was the sort of thing that would take months to do, and yet whoever was stalking me had done so in mere minutes. I shouted again that they show themselves, but didn't get a response. Was I losing my mind? Night was falling fast, but I was too alert and paranoid to sleep. I sat on the bed and watched the door, listening and waiting for something strange to happen. By now I was convinced that someone was toying with me, and I was sure they would be seeking shelter soon enough. The temperature gauge I brought with me read -10, and I knew that didn't account for the whipping winds. But the darkness didn't provide me with any answers, only more questions for the strange events that were happening. I did my best to stay awake as long as I could, gun pointed near the door to wait for the intruder. I kept telling myself it could be a misunderstanding. Maybe the trooper had seen a smaller animal mess with the cabin, and now a regular bystander was roaming the countryside and had stumbled across the cabin. But they refused to enter, an oddity I was having difficulty accepting given how cold it was. No sane person would face the cold on a night like this. But of course there was no guarantee that the person that stalked me was actually in their right mind, I thought. Then I heard what sounded like scratching on the outer walls. Then it sounded like tapping. A repeated, almost patternistic method to their madness. Morse code. I froze and kept the weapon aimed. These places don't allow for anything to lock the door in the event that someone needs them for an emergency. And honestly, I simply wanted this confrontation to be over rather than deal with this taunting any longer. "Come out then," I insisted. It was then, as I sat there and heard the strange noises, I realized it wasn't simply an attempt for me to be drawn outside. It was communication. I listened and searched through the cabinet so I could find something to scribble on. Simple pencil and paper would have to do the trick. L E A V E. As soon as I finished writing it, I felt a cold sweat drip down the back of my neck. The wood-burn stove was going, and I didn't even remember placing any firewood in it. The intruder was giving me a warning, and this was my chance to listen, I realized. But I had no idea where to go, nor do as I sure that this wasn't a trap. The nights here are far worse than anything you might endure in the day, and even with the best of gear, traversing the snow in the middle of the dark was a bad idea. Not just because of the animals, but because of how easily you can get lost. The rapping against the outside of the cabin became more incessant, and I wondered if there was any chance that survival to escape would even be possible. I pushed open the front door and shouted toward the empty horizon, "I am not leaving until you show yourself." In response, I heard the sound of a shotgun, and I dropped to the ground. I couldn't tell for sure where the hunter was firing, but it felt like I was right in their line of target practice. Instantly, I slammed the cabin door shut and clutched my own weapon to my body. The shots hit the side of the cabin repeatedly, the mystery hunter trying to scare me into the open. I wanted to get out of here, but now I wasn't sure outside was any safer. And then things were just beginning to get weird within my confined space. Already it felt like my mind was playing tricks with me about the interior of the cabin. I went to the small kitchen that was sealed off from the rest of the area, assuming it would act as an extra shield for the attacker to break through and buy me more time. Instead, as I opened the door, I found that it led nowhere. I stared at the blank wall, confusion rippling across my body as more gunshots rang out. The door flung open and I heard this strange howling. Something was inside the room with me, but I couldn't see it. It pushed against me the way a strong wind would. It made me fall to the floor and drop my weapon. Then I saw a supernatural phenomenon begin to occur. Had I not experienced it with my own 2 eyes, I'd call myself a liar. But I knew that no force on earth could cause the items in the cabin to begin to levitate. It was as if some great invisible force was tossing items at me, screaming at me to leave. Was it just an animalistic growl, or was there someone else there? Someone from beyond the grave haunting this wilderness? I heard scratching against the windows and the cabin began to rattle, almost like a quake was hitting it. A virtual impossibility in this region. I realized as I stayed completely still and watched the cabin begin to sink toward the snow. The floor was disappearing and my invisible attacker was trying to escape. The windows shattered and the logs began to split in 2. The ground was opening, bits of wood and destroyed chunks of floorboard were being sucked into a strange abysmal whirlpool that was forming a gap between me and the front door. I thought I saw footprints run off in the snow, the stalker escaping ahead of me. I pushed my back against the wall, trying to desperately call for aid on my radio. This felt like a bad fever dream, a dangerous hallucination that would take my life. I wasn't even sure if anyone would hear me, but I had to try. Mayday, Mayday! Ranger Freyer here. I'm over in cabin 305, requesting assistance. I shouted into the device as the sinkhole made a roaring noise. I was peering into a black hole that seemed to be growing deeper and deeper with each passing minute. Then, something unimaginable appeared beneath the darkness. There were rows of teeth, as sharp as sharks, that could be seen near the bottom of the pit, rotating and snarling as I gauged how far a jump to the entrance would be. And the items that had mysteriously been inside the cabin now were cascading downward, swallowed up by this cosmic monster. I tried one last time to get a response to my cry for help, but the radio only gave back static as I prepped the jump. Then I saw a shadow cross the front door of the cabin. The intruder had returned. I steeled myself and leapt across the hole, using all of my strength to make the jump. It felt like the shadow was yanking me to safety, something unseen making sure I didn't die. And I was just barely making it, even with this unseen help. I crawled over the edge of the pit and caught my breath, the radio coming to life with a response. I clutched it and tried to hear what my rescuers had to say, but it sounded like my own voice echoing back. "Mayday, Mayday, this is Ranger Freyer," the voice said as I moved out the front door. The night had shifted to day. The entire Alaskan wilderness no longer looked like the icy land space I was familiar with. Suddenly, I was in a wasteland, a place beyond what this world could comprehend. A mixture of colors and shapes that were swirling in and out of reality as I stumbled to keep upright. It reminded me of a time in college when I'd actually taken psychedelic mushrooms for a trip, and I regretted it. Everything looked like a parallel world, foreign and strange. The trees were either upside down or hanging in the air rather than rooted in the ground. The sky was split open, and stars were moving to and fro across the sky. There were creatures with thousands of eyes in the heavens, reaching down to consume the sinking cabin. A massive pillar of fire rising into the air as the final bite of the rural building were crushed by the darkness. The radio screamed louder. My voice again. "Leave now," it urged. I dropped it in the snow and started to run. It felt like the landscape was stretching on forever. The clouds wouldn't move from the sky, and nor would the sun. Was this some sort of strange phenomenon that would cause the cabin to be trapped in a cosmic glitch? It felt like it was a dream, and yet, as I kept trying to move, my body grew heavy and I collapsed to the bottom of a hill, slamming my nose against a rock and making it bleed. I knew I was still in a reality, just not the one I could make sense of. The ground still shook and split apart. Every step I made seemed to keep me going toward the cabin as it was descending into the snow. It was nearly gone. As I crawled away from the cabin again, I saw a shimmering figure trying to do the same. It reminded me of my younger self, hunting the Alaskan wilderness, trying to survive. Its eyes burned like fire, and it was chasing itself across the horizon. Over and over again, despairing to find a way out. It was hunting me, firing at me and urging me to keep going. Then it dropped a hunting knife in front of me in the snow and tried to attack me. My hope to find it as a guardian angel was shattered. I found myself hardly able to breathe as we stumbled across a sheet of ice, the thin, cold material cracking from our combined body weight. It was shimmering in and out, moving rapidly in a different dimension as it tried to choke me.
Should have left.
The voice boomed. My voice. The voice of a man that had lost everything. I grabbed the knife and fought back. It was fight or die, and the instinct to survive took over me as I stabbed the strange, shimmering creature. I told myself that this couldn't be the same man I was. This had to be a darker self, a different shattered version that had been trapped here for ages. It seemed to shimmer, and in and out of the atmosphere around it until, at last, it appeared to wear my face. An older, gray-haired and hunger-starved version of myself. Maybe the very same one that had been stuck here. Was that what explained all the strange things here? How long, I wondered, had my other self been stranded in this loneliness? I saw the ice begin to break and rush back to the snow as the other me fell into the water, shrieking aloud as his body was completely destroyed by the deadly bleak waters. It only took a second, and I knew he was gone. Then I made my way toward the game trail. I was bleeding, bruised, and hardly able to move. It was hard to stay awake as the overwhelming pain and stress of the event hit me like a ton of bricks. When I made it back to where the sledder was, I collapsed against a tree and tried to control my breathing. Instead, I fell unconscious. The shimmering landscape, my last memory as darkness took over. About an hour later, they found me, offering fresh water and binding me onto their sled to get back home. I still felt delirious, shaking like a leaf as they assisted. I tried to warn them of the dangers of this place, but couldn't even make words come out. "Stay down, mate. You're wounded pretty badly. Something attacked you," the hunter explained. I was barely coherent, still trying to come to terms with everything I'd seen, but I finally told him I needed to get to the operations facility. He got me to the nearest airport where I found cover and waited for a plane. I noticed that the sun seemed to be especially bright for such a cold day, but he looked at me in confusion. "It's just now November. When did you think it was?" he whispered. It occurred to me that I'd been stuck at the cabin for months without even realizing time had passed. Further proof my ordeal was real. The temporal paradox nearly driving me insane. And maybe it did in some fashion, I thought. Some version of me was still there, so desperate to escape, it considered killing me the only solution. Maybe by killing it, I freed him. I didn't know what to make of any of it, but I made the request to operations that we should shut the cabin down. I blamed the bears, and they didn't question that. It's common enough for the animals to ransack the place, even the ones that have properly set up traps. And just to soothe my own weary mind, I told myself it was bears. I convinced myself that what I experienced couldn't have been real. But some deep inner soul that still keeps me restless tells me I know it wasn't. And some part of me wonders if maybe I'm still trapped, and all of this is an illusion. Still at that cabin, waiting and sitting and staring at the door and pointing the rifle, thinking that I just have to wait a few moments longer for rescue. But rescue will never come. Maybe it never did. Or maybe it did, and I'm too far gone.